I woke up before the alarm, sunlight sneaking between the blinds, warming my face while the rest of the room stayed cool and quiet, and I lay there, listening to the distant hum of lawnmowers and birds, thinking about nothing in particular until the soft buzz of my phone on the nightstand cut through the silence like a sudden siren, and without much thought I reached over, half expecting another weather alert or a reminder from the pharmacy, but the screen lit up with something that made my breath catch in my throat. A photo slightly blurry taken from across the parking lot, unmistakably me loading groceries into the trunk of my car, ponytail pulled high, sunglasses on, unaware of any camera aimed in my direction, and below the photo, just 6 simple words that made my stomach twist. "You've never looked better these days." My mouth went dry, my thumb hovering over the screen as if by not touching it, I could somehow undo what I'd just seen, but the sender's number made my chest tighten because it wasn't unknown, it wasn't random. It was familiar in a way that made the world tilt for a moment. My husband's best friend. I sat up, heart thudding, staring at the message while the reality settled over me like ice water down my back. And for a second I wondered if it was a joke, some clumsy attempt at humor that missed its mark, or maybe a misdialed text meant for someone else. But deep down I knew better, and before I could second-guess myself I hit delete, locked my phone, tossed it on the dresser as if distance alone could erase the tight knot curling in my chest. The day dragged on in snapshots of normalcy that felt surreal. Folding laundry, refilling the bird feeder, answering emails with automatic smiles while my mind looped back to that message, that picture, that number I knew too well. By the time my husband walked through the door, loose tie around his neck, pecking my cheek with his usual warmth and asking what was for dinner, I'd nearly convinced myself it was nothing. A misunderstanding I'd blow out of proportion if I spoke it aloud. We ate together, the clatter of silverware on plates filling the spaces between casual conversation. And then, like fate playing its hand, he mentioned that his best friend would be joining us later. Just for a drink, nothing formal, said he'd had a long day and could use the company. My pulse quickened and I nodded too quickly, hiding my face behind my glass, feeling the flush spread across my cheeks. He arrived around 7, smile easy, charm dialed up like always, carrying a bottle of wine and a story about traffic that made my husband laugh. But when his eyes met mine just for a second, something electric passed between us, a flicker I couldn't deny, and when my husband turned to adjust the music he leaned in and with a teasing grin said, "That was quite the parking lot workout yesterday." His words playful but heavy with meaning, and I laughed too loudly, brushing it off, hoping the heat on my face wasn't visible. The evening carried on with light banter and stories of old college antics. But beneath it all, I felt the weight of unsaid words pressing down on my shoulders. Just as I began to relax, believing the night would end without further incident, my husband stretched, yawned, and casually announced, "Hey, he's staying over tonight, too late to drive back." My heart stopped, breath shallow, and I forced a smile, nodding, excusing myself to the kitchen, palms damp, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. The buzz of their conversation in the next room fading into a dull roar as I stared at my reflection in the microwave door and silently wondered how I was going to make it through the night. The next morning felt heavy before it even started, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen mixing with the weight in my chest as I tried to act like everything was normal, moving through the routine like I wasn't on edge, plating scrambled eggs and toast, pouring orange juice into glasses with steady hands that didn't feel steady at all, my husband sitting across from me scrolling through his phone, the friend beside him stirring his coffee slowly, too slowly, and when I finally sat down between them I felt like I was sitting in the middle of something I couldn't name, every clink of silverware against plates too loud, every silence stretching longer than it should, and when I looked up for just a second I caught his gaze, not accidental, not casual, lingering a fraction too long before he looked away, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine, and I told myself I was imagining it, reading too much into nothing, that it was just leftover nerves from last night's message. That maybe I needed sleep or fresh air or both, but then it happened again, his eyes on me while he lifted his coffee cup, a small smirk playing on his lips like we shared some secret joke, and I forced myself to focus on my husband's voice as he reminded me we had plans that afternoon, trying to nod at the right moments, laugh in the right places, even though my heart felt too fast and my skin too tight. After breakfast I found a way to keep busy, wiping down counters that were already clean, sorting laundry that didn't need sorting, anything to avoid those glances, but somehow he was always nearby, leaning against the doorframe with that same casual posture, that same almost smile, like he was waiting for me to say something I'd never say. My husband suggested we all go to the park for a workout, said the fresh air would do us good, and I agreed too quickly, eager for distractions, for movement, for any excuse to shake this buzzing tension off my skin. At the park, the sun was bright and the breeze light, families walking dogs, kids tossing footballs, joggers passing by with headphones in, the world carrying on like nothing was wrong while I stretched on the grass, pretending not to notice him watching me from the bench, sunglasses hiding his eyes but not the weight of his stare. We moved to the pull-up bars, my husband starting first with ease, counting reps aloud, then me struggling through the first few, arms trembling, breath short, until he was suddenly there, his hands on my waist, steadying me, lifting just enough to help but close enough that I could feel the heat of his body against mine, his breath near my ear whispering, "You've got this." And when I let go, dropping to the ground, I turned too fast, our faces inches apart, his hands still on my back, and for one impossible moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, heart racing as if it might burst, until he stepped back with that same damn smirk and turned away. I didn't speak the whole ride home, staring out the window, replaying that moment over and over, telling myself it was nothing, that I was being ridiculous, that he was just helping, nothing more, but my pulse didn't believe me. That night, after dinner and small talk and a movie I couldn't follow, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while my husband slept beside me, his breathing slow and steady, and my phone lit up on the nightstand with a single message that made my blood run cold. I never allowed myself to think about it before. I closed my eyes, wishing I could unsee it, but the words burned into my mind, heavy and inescapable, and I knew this wasn't over. I spent the entire day convincing myself that tonight would smooth everything over, that if I invited both of them out for dinner in public, surrounded by noise and laughter and other people's conversations, this strange tension would dissolve back into nothing. So I made the reservation at our favorite little cafe on Main Street, the one with the warm lights strung across the ceiling and checkered tablecloths and servers who knew our names, and when I mentioned it casually over breakfast, both of them agreed without hesitation, my husband giving me a warm smile, the friend flashing that familiar grin that now made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain, and all afternoon I kept myself busy, checking my reflection more times than I wanted to admit, changing outfits twice, telling myself it didn't matter but knowing deep down it did. And when we arrived, the place was busy but cozy, filled with clinking glasses and soft music, and we slid into a booth by the window, ordering wine and laughing about old stories as if nothing had changed, though every time his eyes met mine across the table, there was a weight I couldn't shake, a silent conversation humming beneath the surface of every word. I kept glancing at my husband, his easy smile and light-hearted jokes making me feel both comforted and guilty, and I tried to focus on him, on the warmth of his hand resting on mine, on the life we'd built together, but the electricity across the table kept crackling louder in my head, and when dessert came I barely touched it, my appetite gone, replaced with nerves buzzing through every limb. My husband excused himself to the restroom, pressing a quick kiss to my temple as he stood, and I told myself to breathe, to hold steady, to not read into anything, but before I could even gather my thoughts, the friend stood too, saying he'd walk me to the car since it was already getting late, and I nodded, grateful for the fresh air, telling myself it was nothing, just good manners. But the moment we stepped out into the cool night, the weight of everything settled in heavier than ever. We walked in silence down the sidewalk, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind us, the distant hum of traffic filling the gaps, and just as we reached the car he stopped, placing his hand gently on my arm, and I turned, my heart in my throat, before he whispered, "I'm sorry." And before I could react, his lips brushed against mine, soft, warm, brief but undeniable, sending shockwaves down my spine, and I froze for half a second before instinct took over and I pushed him back, breath catching in my chest, eyes wide and wild, his hands raised in surrender, his face full of regret and something else I couldn't name, and without a word I yanked open the car door, sliding into the driver's seat with shaking hands, fingers trembling as I fumbled with the keys, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, and as I pulled out of the lot, my breath came in short bursts, a mix of panic, anger, and something darker I couldn't admit to myself. The drive home was a blur of headlights and street signs, my mind racing faster than the car, replaying those few seconds on a loop, my body betraying me with goosebumps and heat I couldn't shake, and when I finally parked in the driveway I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to steady my breath, trying to gather what little composure I had left before walking inside. My husband was already upstairs when I entered, calling down that he'd left the porch light on for me, his voice calm and trusting, slicing through me like a knife, and I forced a casual response, climbing the stairs with leaden feet, slipping under the covers beside him, his arm draping over me like it always did, warm and safe and familiar, but inside I was spiraling. At 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, and with hesitant fingers, I turned it over to read one single line that made my chest ache and my stomach twist all over again. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself. The next morning I woke up determined to bury everything that had happened, to lock it away so deep that even I couldn't reach for it in weak moments, and I forced myself into the routine with a smile too bright, laughter too quick, gestures too perfect, brewing coffee exactly how my husband liked it, humming softly in the kitchen like someone without a care in the world. And when he came downstairs rubbing sleep from his eyes, I greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, asking about his day ahead. Before he could ask about mine, keeping the conversation light, playful, full of tiny moments designed to remind both of us who we were supposed to be. He mentioned taking a drive out of town, said it had been too long since we just enjoyed the outdoors, grilling in the fresh air, and I agreed immediately, clinging to the idea that distraction could save me from myself. So we packed the car, loaded up coolers, folding chairs, and blankets. And when his friend arrived with a six-pack and that familiar easy grin, I didn't flinch, didn't let my pulse show on my face, just greeted him politely, looking straight through him as if nothing had ever happened. The drive was filled with country roads, golden fields rolling out on either side, music playing low on the radio, and my husband's hand resting on my knee like it always did, while the friend sat in the back seat humming along, occasionally tossing out stories that made us both laugh. And for a while I let myself believe the day could be simple, that maybe if I just acted right, it would all settle back into place. At the park we found a shaded spot under the trees, spread out the blanket, lit the grill, and everything felt normal on the surface, the scent of burgers sizzling on the fire mixing with fresh-cut grass and wildflowers in bloom, kids playing frisbee nearby, couples walking hand in hand, and I threw myself into small tasks, slicing tomatoes, setting out plates, pouring drinks, never allowing myself to be still long enough to think. But every time I glanced up he was watching me with that same knowing smile, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, a private joke only he and I understood, and it made my skin prickle with a heat I didn't want. We ate, laughed, and toasted to nothing in particular, but his eyes never left me, and when my husband turned away to check the grill, the friend's gaze lingered, holding mine a fraction too long, and I felt the weight of it in my chest like a stone. After dinner, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned soft and golden, we packed up slowly, reluctant to leave the peace of the evening behind, and when we returned home, my husband went inside to put the leftovers away while I sat on the porch swing, rocking gently, breathing in the night air heavy with lilacs and damp grass, trying to calm the storm inside me. Footsteps on the wooden planks broke my focus, and before I could turn, his voice was in my ear, soft and low, words meant only for me. "You were in my dreams last night." My breath caught, heart pounding painfully, and I whispered, "Please don't," barely able to get the words out, my voice shaking under the weight of what we both knew but couldn't say. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded once, quietly stepping back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, and the overwhelming knowledge that pretending would only get harder from here. I came home that evening expecting nothing more than the usual routine of reheated leftovers and quiet television, but the moment I stepped through the door I smelled something different, something warm and inviting, garlic and fresh herbs and melted butter filling the air like a soft embrace, and I turned the corner to see the dining table set with candles flickering gently, our best plates laid out, wine breathing in the decanter, and my husband standing there with that boyish grin I hadn't seen in so long, holding a kitchen towel and looking proud of himself in a way that made my heart ache. He said nothing at first, just kissed my cheek and pulled out a chair for me, telling me dinner was ready, and I sat down, overwhelmed by the simple sweetness of it all, blinking back the tightness in my throat as he served pasta from scratch, salad dressed perfectly, warm bread pulled from the oven, and every detail told me he'd planned this for me, for us, without a reason, without a holiday or anniversary, just because he wanted to remind me that we were still here, still real. And as we ate, he told stories about work and asked about my day, his eyes so full of care and focus that I felt stripped bare under the weight of it. I laughed at his old jokes, leaned into his warmth, and for the first time in weeks, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place, how easy he made everything feel, how safe and steady his presence had always been, and I hated myself a little for forgetting that, for letting my mind wander where it shouldn't have gone. After dinner we sat on the couch with wine in hand, the glow from the fireplace dancing across the room, and he reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, thumb tracing soft circles on my skin like he used to do when we were younger, before life got so busy and predictable, and I felt that warmth spread through me, soothing but heavy with guilt. He leaned in slowly, brushing my hair back, his lips soft and familiar against mine, tender and real, and I kissed him back with everything I had, trying to pour every ounce of remorse and love and apology into that moment, hoping he could feel it even if he didn't know why. And when he pulled back and looked at me with that quiet smile, I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away before he could see. We spent the rest of the evening in a peaceful silence, curled up together, his hand resting on my hip, steady and comforting, and for a while I let myself believe that this could be enough, that I could close the door on all the confusion and guilt and return to the life I knew, the life that mattered. But when he finally drifted off to sleep, his breathing deep and slow beside me, my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a sound that cut through the quiet like a knife, and I reached for it with shaking fingers, already knowing who it would be, and there it was, the words burning into the screen with terrifying simplicity: "I won't give up." My breath caught in my throat, and I sat there staring at those 4 words, my heart pounding with fear and something darker I didn't want to name, and as I turned off the phone and placed it face down, I felt the walls of my carefully constructed world start to tremble, cracks forming in places I could no longer ignore, and I lay awake long after the house went silent, haunted by the knowledge that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I told myself to avoid him, to keep busy, to focus on my husband and the life I had carefully built brick by brick over years of trust and routine, but life never plays by those rules, and it happened on a rainy Tuesday when I stopped by the grocery store for milk and bread, just another ordinary errand on an ordinary day, pushing the cart slowly through the aisles, lost in thought, when I turned the corner and there he was, standing in front of the coffee display, smiling like he'd been waiting for me all along. And before I could retreat or pretend I didn't see him, he reached for the same carton of almond milk I did, his fingers brushing mine, warm and electric, sending shivers up my arm before I yanked my hand back like I'd touched an open flame, my breath catching in my throat, heart racing as he looked at me with a softness I couldn't bear. I stammered out a quick excuse, turning away, pretending to compare labels I didn't care about, but every nerve in my body was alive, betraying me, and when I finally escaped to the checkout line, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my wallet, forcing a tight smile at the cashier as I fumbled with change. That evening, my husband suggested dinner with family, something casual, just a few people around the table, laughter and easy conversation, but the moment I saw him there, already seated, already comfortable, I felt my stomach twist into knots, and I pasted on a smile so convincing even I almost believed it. We ate roasted chicken and green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, my husband telling stories about work while I focused on chewing and swallowing and not meeting his friend's eyes. But he wouldn't let me be, slipping small jokes into the conversation about how I always order the same salad at every restaurant, how I never finish my glass of wine, each comment laced with gentle teasing and a knowing smirk that felt like a private conversation between us, one no one else at the table could hear. My husband laughed, elbowed me playfully, telling me I was predictable, and I forced out a laugh that sounded too high, too forced, eyes darting down to my plate as heat crept up my neck. And when dessert was served and coffee poured, I excused myself, claiming I needed some air. I stepped out onto the balcony, the night cool and quiet, the hum of distant traffic blending with the soft chirp of crickets, and I leaned against the railing, closing my eyes, trying to steady my breath. But the sound of the sliding door opening behind me made my heart jump, and I knew without turning who it was. He stood beside me, too close, the scent of his cologne mixing with the fresh night air, and for a moment we said nothing, silence stretching thin between us until his voice broke it, soft and pained. "It hurts to see you and not say anything." I turned to him, my mouth dry, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it, and I whispered, "Please stop," the words barely audible, trembling on my lips. But my eyes betrayed me, wide and uncertain, unable to hide the mess of emotions swirling inside, and he saw it. I knew he did, because his expression softened, his hand twitching at his side like he wanted to reach for me but knew he couldn't, and without another word, he nodded once, stepped back into the house, leaving me alone. With the weight of everything unspoken, the night pressing in around me, heavy and suffocating as I realized that whatever this was, it was no longer under control. I woke up exhausted, the weight of the past few days pressing down on me like a lead blanket, suffocating and relentless, and I knew I couldn't keep living in this half-reality, constantly glancing over my shoulder, heart racing every time my phone buzzed, breath catching every time his eyes lingered too long. So I made a decision, one that felt impossible but necessary, and I texted him to meet me at the small park near the library, a quiet place where words could be spoken without interruption. And when he arrived, his face hopeful but cautious, I took a deep breath and told him everything I had rehearsed in my head 100 times, my voice shaking but steady enough to carry the weight of what I needed to say. I told him we couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep dancing around something that had no future and only risked tearing apart everything good and real in my life. And I asked him, pleaded with him, not to cross paths with me anymore unless we were in a group, to leave this tension behind before it ruined more than just fleeting moments. He looked at me for a long time, eyes dark with something I didn't want to name, and then he nodded slowly, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for weeks, and he said softly, "Then this is the last time," before turning and walking away, his shoulders tense, hands stuffed in his pockets, leaving me alone on that bench, heart pounding with relief and sorrow twisted together in a knot so tight I couldn't breathe. I thought that would be the end, that I could finally put this behind me, that we could both move on and fall back into the safe routine of before. But life never grants clean endings, and the very next morning my husband, cheerful and unsuspecting, suggested we drive to his office together, said he wanted me to see the new renovations and maybe grab lunch after, and I agreed, forcing a smile, convincing myself it would be harmless, that the storm had passed. We arrived mid-morning, the lobby buzzing with conversation, secretaries moving quickly with files in hand, and I walked beside him trying to absorb the energy, the busyness, the sense of order and normalcy, until he stepped into a meeting, leaving me waiting in the break room with a cup of coffee I didn't really want. That's when I heard it, voices carrying through the half-open door, laughter and low conversation, and I froze as I recognized his voice, unmistakable, rich and smooth, speaking to a colleague, and though I knew I shouldn't listen, I couldn't help myself. His words were light but edged with meaning, talking about temptation, about lines that get blurry when you least expect it, and I heard the colleague laugh, teasing him about falling for someone he shouldn't, asking if it was serious or just a distraction, and my heart clenched as he replied, "It's complicated, but some things are worth the risk." I felt the blood drain from my face, hands trembling around the paper cup, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't stop listening even though every word felt like a stone in my stomach. The colleague joked about messy hearts and bad timing, and he just laughed, soft and resigned, and said, "I told her it was the last time, but I don't think I meant it." I stumbled back before they could see me, slipping out of the room and down the hall, my heart racing, breath shallow, vision blurred by tears I couldn't let fall. And as I waited for my husband to finish his meeting, plastering a smile on my face that felt like a mask cracking at the edges, I knew deep down that walking away would never be enough, not when the damage was already done. The house was quiet that afternoon, sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, dancing across the marble countertop as I stood slicing strawberries, trying to focus on something simple, something pure, something that didn't make my chest tighten or my thoughts spin out of control, and I told myself over and over that I had closed that door, that I had made the right choice, that the conversation at the park was the end of it. But when the doorbell rang and I opened it to find him standing there, hands in his pockets, eyes tired and heavy, I knew I'd been lying to myself, because instead of sending him away, I stepped aside without a word, and he walked in like he belonged there, the air between us thick with everything unspoken. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending not to notice him standing just behind me, his presence warm and unsettling, close enough to feel but not close enough to touch, until he finally stepped forward, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, his breath brushing against my neck as he leaned in slowly, lips pressing softly into the curve of my skin, and I froze, eyes fluttering shut for a moment too long, heart racing in my chest as guilt and longing twisted together in a knot that stole my breath. I whispered his name, a warning and a plea all at once, but before I could pull away I heard the front door open, the familiar sound of keys dropping into the ceramic bowl by the entryway, footsteps heavy and steady moving down the hall, and I panicked, stepping forward quickly, but his hand lingered a second too long, the warmth of his lips still burning on my skin, and then my husband appeared in the doorway, stopping mid-step, his eyes landing on the scene before him with a clarity that made my stomach drop. Time slowed to a crawl, silence stretching so tight I thought it might snap, the ticking of the clock on the wall suddenly loud and relentless, and I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe as he looked from me to his friend, his jaw tightening, his face unreadable, and then after what felt like an eternity he spoke, his voice quiet but heavy, each word sharp and deliberate. I knew. My heart shattered in that moment, the weight of his words crashing down on me, heavier than I thought I could bear, and I opened my mouth to explain, to deny, to beg, but no sound came out, and before I could find the right words, his friend stepped back, his expression full of regret but also something resolute. And without saying a word, he turned and walked past my husband out the door, leaving the two of us standing in that kitchen surrounded by the scent of strawberries and betrayal. My husband didn't move, didn't speak again, just stood there staring at the empty space where his friend had been, his shoulders tense, his breath shallow, and I wanted to reach for him, to apologize, to explain that it hadn't meant anything, that it was a moment of weakness, a mistake I would undo 1,000 times if I could. But I knew better, knew that words wouldn't fix what had just broken between us, and so I stood there in silence, tears burning in my eyes, the weight of my choices suffocating me as the room seemed to shrink around us. He finally turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and slow, and the sound of the front door closing behind him echoed through the house like a final sentence, leaving me alone in the kitchen with nothing but regret and the taste of something I could never take back. The days that followed felt like walking through fog, every sound muffled, every color dulled, the weight of silence pressing down on me so heavily that even breathing felt like a task, and the house, once filled with small daily noises and comfortable routine, now echoed with emptiness that made my skin crawl, my husband barely speaking, moving through rooms like a ghost, his presence heavy and cold, and I tried to stay busy, cleaning already spotless counters, folding and refolding laundry, cooking meals that sat untouched, the quiet between us louder than any argument could have been, and at night, I lay awake listening to his steady breathing, wishing he would roll toward me, touch my hand, say something, anything, but he never did. And the distance between us grew wider with each passing moment until it felt like we lived in separate worlds under the same roof. I rehearsed apologies in my head, whispered explanations to the bathroom mirror, but every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words stuck to my throat like glue, and he never asked, never pressed, only existed beside me in a silence that cut deeper than anger ever could. On the fourth evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house sat in dim golden light, he finally spoke, his voice soft but steady, like he had been rehearsing too, and he said, "We need to talk." And I turned to him, my heart pounding with dread and hope tangled together. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his eyes tired but kind, and he took a deep breath before saying, "I don't blame you," pausing, searching for the right words, "but I can't live with this." My breath caught, tears welling up before I could stop them, spilling over onto my cheeks as I shook my head, the words tumbling out between sobs, fragmented and desperate. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean. I never wanted to hurt you. Please believe me." But he just sat there, watching me with a sadness that cut deeper than any sharp word could have, and I could see it in his eyes, the love still there but buried under layers of disappointment and pain I had put there. I reached across the table, my hand trembling, fingers brushing against his. But he didn't move, didn't pull away, just let me touch him for a moment before gently pulling his hand back, resting it in his lap as he looked down at the table, the silence between us heavier than ever. I begged him to talk, to yell, to tell me he hated me if that would make it easier, but he simply shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "I don't hate you. I just can't stay." And those words broke something inside me that I knew would never fully heal. He stood slowly, moving through the room with a quiet grace that made it all the more painful, gathering a small bag he must have packed earlier without me noticing, and he turned to face me one last time, his eyes soft and resolute, and I choked out a broken, "Please don't go." But he just smiled sadly, that familiar smile that once brought me comfort and now felt like goodbye. He walked to the door, opened it quietly, the soft creak of the hinges echoing in the silence, and stepped out into the evening without looking back, closing the door gently behind him, and the click of the latch felt like a final period on a sentence I never wanted to end, leaving me alone in the kitchen, tears streaming down my face, the weight of my choices finally crashing down in full, cold and irreversible. The house felt larger than it ever had, every room echoing with silence so thick it pressed against my chest, suffocating and cold, the walls that once held laughter and routine now heavy with absence, the stillness almost mocking as I wandered from room to room searching for something to hold on to. but there was nothing left except the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock that seemed louder than ever before, marking the passing of minutes that felt endless and empty. His coat no longer hung by the door, his shoes gone from the mat, and I found myself staring at the space where they used to be, as if by sheer will I could make them reappear, make time fold back on itself and bring me to a moment before everything cracked wide open. I made coffee out of habit and poured it into his favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim and the faded logo, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it, just sat at the table staring at the swirling steam until it disappeared, leaving nothing but lukewarm regret in a cup I no longer had the right to touch. The hours dragged, sunlight shifting across the floorboards in long, slow stretches, fading into the soft blue of early evening, and still I sat unmoving, waiting for a sound that wouldn't come, the ring of his keys or the creak of the front door, but the silence stayed. My phone buzzed against the table, startling me out of my trance, the screen lighting up with his name, not my husband's but his friend's, the man who set this avalanche in motion, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, my thumb hovering over the screen, torn between curiosity and revulsion, between wanting to scream and wanting to pretend none of it had ever happened. Finally I opened it and there it was, just 5 simple words that twisted the knife a little deeper. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I stared at those words, the weight of them heavier than they deserved to be, my fingers trembling as I typed out a reply, then erased it, typed again, then erased, because what was left to say? No apology could stitch this back together. No regret could erase what had been done or fix what I had broken, so instead I deleted the message without responding, watched his name disappear from my screen like a ghost finally fading, and I powered off my phone, turning it face down on the table with finality. The room felt colder then, shadows creeping in around the edges as night settled in, and I stood slowly, each movement deliberate and heavy, walking to the front door and pausing for just a moment, hand resting on the knob, listening to the silence one last time. I locked the door with a soft click, the sound final and sharp, slipped on my coat and stepped outside into the cool night air, the street quiet and still, streetlights flickering in the distance, the world carrying on as if it hadn't just come undone inside my walls. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, each step measured, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound, and for the first time I truly felt the weight of emptiness, of finality, of knowing that some mistakes can't be undone, that some choices echo louder than apologies ever could. And as I reached the end of the street and turned toward the quiet stretch of road ahead, I understood with absolute clarity that everything I had mattered was gone, and there was no one left to blame but myself.